Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of a series of national held with Australia's new Climate Commission. May we welcome the commissioners, and I'll briefly introduce them to you. From your left, Chief Commissioner, internationally acclaimed scientist, writer, conservationist and former Australian of the Year, Professor Tim Flannery. Thank you. Adjacent to Tim, Mr. Jerry Houston, recently retired President of BP Australia. Thank you. Professor Leslie Hughes, Head of the Department of Biological Sciences at Macquarie University. Professor Will Steffen, Executive Director of the Australian National University Climate Change Institute. And Mr. Roger Beale, Executive Director of Economics and Policy at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you very much for that. Professor Flannery will introduce the commissioners more a little later. I'd also like to acknowledge that our forum is being held on the traditional lands of the Wadawurrung people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. You're welcome to do that too. For those who don't know me or think that my only task in my life has ever been to do the weather on the telly, my name is Rob Gell. I'm an environmentalist and earth scientist, a practicing environmental communications consultant. I'm also the National President of Greening Australia, member of the Victorian Coastal Council. I chair a UNESCO biosphere on the other side of Port Phillip Bay, and I'm a member of the Victorian Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability's reference group, so I hope I'll be able to faithfully facilitate this evening's discussions. A couple of housekeeping matters. Ladies and gentlemen, this session will be recorded for live broadcast and publicly available on the website. I think that's a very good thing to do. So if you would prefer not to be digitally recorded or photographed, there's an area that you should move to, and I believe that you've been asked about that as you came in. I just want to remind people about that. Also, if you have a question to ask, you will be asked to sign a release form so that we can continue to use your image, so just be aware of that as well. Now, because the Commission values your feedback, there are certainly some feedback forms on your seats, and it's very important that you fill these in and pass these back at the conclusion of the event. Exits, there's the exit that you came in from. There's another exit hidden behind over here and some more on the south side of the building. In a case of an emergency, you'll be directed to one of those exits. Toilets are at the back of the room, and may I ask you please to make sure that your mobile phone won't ring. I understand how precious they are to you, so at least have it on vibrate or whatever is your preference, but please don't let it ring in fairness to the questions being asked of Commissioners. The aim of this evening is to begin a conversation. I think that's a legitimate word to use. The Commission is here to listen, as well as to share its knowledge and experiences. We'll hear from each Commissioner on what they've heard from people in Geelong. They've been out and about today. We'll also hear from some of the Geelong community on their climate change concerns. We have had a large number of questions submitted as you registered for, and we'll put those into two categories. Certainly we'll look at science, but also look at carbon pricing as a key issue as well. But initially, Commissioner Flannery has asked that we do that. I do request, though, that your questions be focused and as brief as possible so that we can have an opportunity for as many people as possible to participate actively. So if you're making statements, I'm afraid I will cut you off, and I'll take them as comments or statements so we move on to legitimate questions. The request is conducted politely and with a high level of mutual respect. Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce Professor Tim Flannery as the Chief Climate Commissioner, of course, I've mentioned already he's one of Australia's writers on climate change, an internationally acclaimed scientist. He works around the world, explorer, conservationist, and named Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Please welcome Tim Flannery.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you all for coming out on this rather chilly Geelong evening. I must admit that with the Cats game on in Melbourne, I thought we might be looking at 2 people and a dog or something like that, so I'm very, very pleased to see such a large group of people interested in this subject. I just want to briefly explain to you about the Commission's role and our intent being here tonight. This is our first event, and we came to Geelong, we wanted to come to Geelong specifically because we felt that in areas like this, the climate change and the community and government response to the issue are critically important to your futures. You have many industries down here that are trade exposed, that are carbon intensive. You're also in an area that's being affected by climate change. So it's important that we as an Australian, as a nation, get the response to climate change right, particularly for places like Geelong. The Commission is an independent body. We don't take advice, we don't take direction from the Minister or from the government, and I value our independence particularly, as do all of the Commissioners. I've criticised John Howard and Kevin Rudd on climate policy, and I value my independence in that area and my distance from politics greatly, and I want to carry that into the Commission's role. And I think it's very important that we remain independent. Otherwise, why would people listen to us? We could just be giving you political spin, and that I'm determined not to do. We really want to foster a deeper community discussion about climate science, about the international environment that Australia is acting in, and on the options, the economic options that are before us as a nation. It's a genuine two-way dialogue. This morning we were at the Shell refinery here in Geelong, and it was a fantastic experience for me to see that extraordinary thing down there. It's an amazing industrial complex, and to hear firsthand from workers down there about their concerns and about the structure and nature of their business. Over lunch today we had a fantastic community lunch. Your federal representative for North Geelong turned up, along with a number of state representatives and 3 mayors from the district and business leaders. We had, I think, a really constructive and deep engagement over that lunch. And so we come somewhat armed this evening with a sense of the challenges and opportunities that present themselves in this region. I'm going to be very, very brief because I really want to hear from you. Just to reassure you that we'll get you home by 7:30, by the time that the Cats game is due to start. So don't worry about that. Don't panic and run out at the end. We're going to stick to our schedule. Once again, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to a very lively couple of hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We now have for you, just to begin proceedings, 3 brief presentations from members of the Geelong community. First, we have with us students from the Geelong Students Environmental Network. I'll ask them to stand up and reveal themselves to you. And their spokesperson, Tycho Wharton from Cardinia College, will say a few words. Welcome, Tycho.
The Geelong Students Environment Network is a student network promoting collaboration on the topic of the environment and sustainability between different schools in Geelong. To date, we have promoted collaboration between schools and shared ideas from the installation of solar panels to implementing better recycling systems, as well as how positive interaction between schools can lead to the community as a whole making a positive change. We are very grateful to have the opportunity today to represent the opinions of many students. We believe that it is important for these discussions to be had with all members of the community and should be promoted to a greater extent within schools. Young people have an important perspective that should be taken into consideration when forming a policy that will define our future. As a group, we believe that it is vital that action be taken on the issue of climate change. Thus, we are very pleased that the government is taking the step of starting this discussion, of engaging with communities to develop the best possible solutions. We understand that this is a difficult debate. There'll be many hard choices, many different viewpoints. But I'd just like you to know that we as young people are doing everything we can through all available channels to look for solutions. However, action from our leaders and communities is needed to secure a safe future for our climate. We hope we have shown you that young people have an important opinion on this issue. And this is not simply about numbers, models, and impact statements. This is about our future. We can act in our local environment, but lasting change needs the support of government across Australia and across the world. We hope that this is the first of many productive sessions for the Climate Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Tycho. The second local representative is Councillor John Dool. Councillor Dool is a qualified pilot and flying instructor who also studied building and project management at RMIT and worked in architecture in Melbourne. His hobbies include bushwalking, flying in outback Australia, which you would do, I suppose, if you did that, alternative Australian music, art house films, theatre and collecting books. He was elected to the City of Greater Geelong Council in November 2008. Councillor Dool holds the portfolio for climate change and environment and sustainability. Please welcome Councillor Dool.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on which we meet, the Wathaurong, and may I pay my respects to the elders both past and present. Can I also acknowledge the Climate Commission, Professor Tim Flannery, Professor Will Steffen, Professor Leslie Hughes, Mr Jerry Houston and Mr Roger Beale. And I'd also like to acknowledge fellow councillors, Councillors Andy Richard, Stretch Quintel and Barbara Abley. It gives me great pleasure to welcome the Climate Commission to Geelong, and we are delighted as a council that Geelong has been chosen to be the first stop on a national tour. As you're aware, Geelong is a key manufacturing region. It accounts for close to half of all the revenue generated by businesses in the Barwon region, a total of $13.8 billion. We are home to Alcoa, Ford, Boral, Godfrey Hirst, Shell, Blue Circle Cement and other major manufacturing companies. Our region's continued prosperity depends on these industries and others being able to transition to a low carbon future without losing jobs for our people. Council, together with our major companies, are committed to reducing our carbon footprint. As an organisation, we have developed a number of greenhouse responses which has resulted in a considerable reduction of our carbon emissions. Ambitious targets for councils are being met through conversion to green energy technology such as solar panels, cogeneration, hybrid cars and wind turbines, as well as major water-saving initiatives. We also have Eco Challenge, which is a cross-organisational program for reducing greenhouse emissions across various council departments. In 2009, Council embarked on a climate change adaptation strategy, which is one of the first for local governments in the state. This strategy, now completed, has assisted Council in identifying the risks associated with climate change. Implementing the strategy will build resilience internally and within the broader community. The Climate Change Adaptation Strategy is about having a framework for Council to manage climate change risks and maximise opportunities into the future. Climate change will continue to present a variety of risks to Council that need to be identified, evaluated and prioritised. A Climate Change Adaptation Strategy allows Council to better use current resources and provides Council with a better understanding for the future resource planning, and therefore Council will be better able to adjust to climate change impacts. Along with the non-government organisation ICLEI, who supports local governments around the world to reduce their greenhouse emissions, I attended the International Climate Change Conference COP15 at Copenhagen in Denmark in 2009. This was in a political capacity to assist ICLEI in lobbying for local government and subnational governments to be included in the text of any international binding agreements. Last year we launched a very important pilot program, which I'm very proud of, Future Proofing Geelong, which seeks to position Geelong as a demonstration city, showcasing our capacity to transition to a low-carbon future while continuing to develop existing industry, grow our economy and support our city's livability. As part of future-proofing Geelong, we're about to launch a low-carbon growth plan in late April, which will be an Australian first. The program's research identifies actions to reduce our region's emissions and highlights opportunities to collaborate with government, local industry and the community to transition to a low-carbon economy. And can I acknowledge the partners, Sustainability Victoria, Department of Sustainability Environment and the EPA, and the cooperation of Committee for Geelong, Barwon Water, G21 and major industries within Geelong. As you can see, we acknowledge the reality of climate change, and a great deal of work, including research and planning, has been done in collaboration with others to identify opportunities to reduce our greenhouse emissions. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss how a price on carbon will be implemented and the effects this will have on our local economy. We acknowledge the need for Australia to act to reduce global emissions, but again, any action must be considered with the competitiveness of our local businesses. In 2008, our Mayor led a delegation to Canberra, which I attended, representing the most impacted industrial communities within Australia, including Geelong, Central Queensland, Illawarra, Portland and Tasmania. The delegation called on the government and the opposition to introduce a policy that would help reduce global emissions without driving Australian industry and investment offshore. I wish to thank the opportunity to present on behalf of the City of Greater Geelong tonight, and thank you again for visiting Geelong and giving our community this opportunity to have a say and be involved in addressing the very important issue of climate change, the reality.
Thank you, Councillor. We have one more presentation to come, but I meant to ask the Commissioner or Commissioners whether you had any response to either Tycho's presentation or to John's just now. Do you want to make a comment at this stage? Take an opportunity or not? We move on.
Perhaps we should
move on. Thank you. Our final presentation is from Wayne Klemple. Wayne is a resident of Geelong. He works in Melbourne. He's a member of the Socialist Alliance. Welcome to Wayne.
Thank you, Rob. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What are we here for tonight? Discuss building of some elaborate sort of merry-go-round, or are we here to build a carbon-free future for generations unseen? There's not a great deal of sense building some sort of elaborate merry-go-round. We really should be focused on carbon-free future, and that's how I see the carbon tax. Do we take from Peter and give money to Paul, and Paul gives money to Mary, Bob and Jane, who eventually gives it back to Peter in some way or other? This is how I'd see the carbon tax. Taxing the big polluters who pass the cost on to the consumer, and then the government gives $3 billion, and then the government gives 13 billion subsidies back to the polluters again. This won't work. What we do need is to actually fix the problem. We need to stop companies polluting the atmosphere through regulation and not by bringing in a merry-go-round tax. The governments need to stop paying companies to pollute, abolish $13 million subsidies in fossil fuel tax to all fossil companies who burn fossil fuel. A Victorian branch of the Beyond Zero Emissions, it's an organisation in Melbourne, has demonstrated that it would be possible to convert the economy to 100% carbon-free in 10 years, base power included. And according to Zero Emissions, that is possible. The government needs to fund the transition. And the most important infrastructure was initially built by the government, and it needs to happen again to guarantee renewable energy. We need to make changes in the way we live and work. We do more regarding energy conservation, shift funding from roads to massive expansion in public transport and rail freight. We have known about climate change for more than 20-odd years, and our politicians still have done nothing. We need to make changes to the system we operate under. God knows privatisation doesn't work. Governments need to stop fiddling with the market to cut emissions and actually set scientifically based targets. Persuade other countries to follow our lead. How can we pay for all this? Money our government wastes on a daily basis is astronomical. Billions of dollars are spent on wars that could be spent on funding renewable energy instead. The mining companies are making megabucks from the mining boom as well. So Tim, tell Julia, Bob and Tony, if he will listen, we don't need a carbon tax or a big plan to do nothing. We need to start building a new way to live and a new future for now and today. So let's leave future generations a bright, clean, green future to play in, not a backyard full of useless toys. I'm sure they'll thank you for it. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree all three of our speakers have raised most of the issues in one way or another. We now go to our question and answer process. Sure, Tim?
Sorry, Rob.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond and thank all three of our speakers. Tycho, you're our future, and you get it in one. I think it's that this transition has to be done. And John and Wayne, you're sort of in the middle of it now, in the middle of this transition that we wished was going faster. And the Beyond Zero Emissions 2020, you're quite right, we could do it, but the cost has been estimated by Beyond Zero Emissions as $370 billion over 10 years. It's a big hunk of money. Thank heavens, I think we've got a little bit more time than that to get to zero. We hope to be somewhere there by the middle of the century. But can I say that, just to reinforce the point, that the Commission's work really is to build the strength in our community to see enduring change, enduring and sensible reform that'll get us to where we need to be over time, unless we have the community support and the community understanding of these issues. We're not going to get the political reform that we require. And it's not something that's going to be fixed tonight or next week or even this year. We might make big progress this year, but nevertheless, it's not going to be fixed this year. This debate's going to be going on for decades, and that's why the government, through us, are investing in you, the community, to try to get just a more intelligent, a better level of debate and discussion. So thank you all once again for being here, and thank you particularly, the three of you, for those presentations. They were really most welcome. Thank you.
Tim, you interrupt whenever you like. You're the boss.
Thanks, mate.
Now, we have, as we mentioned, a number of pre-registered questions. We've got ample of those. But Tim suggested that rather than go to those, we actually take questions from the floor initially. Then we'll use those to try to fill in the gaps that the commissioners think are questions that really start to reveal the spread of issues. So when we ask a question, we'd like to try to get a good spread of questions across both questions around climate science itself, and then particularly around carbon pricing, but there's a whole range of others about energy technologies that might be developed, impacts on agriculture, and other things that you might want to raise. So please do those as well. So could we have, when you stand up, could you please let us know who you are? You also, as I mentioned, you'll be asked to sign a release, an indemnity form, so that we can actually continue to use your image in your either still photographs or video images on the website and elsewhere. Let's begin then. Who would like to ask a question? The lady there in the green.
Good evening. My name is Sue McLean. I represent an environment group, Geelong Community for Good Life, that attempts to get industry in Geelong region to reduce its pollution level, including the company you went to see yesterday, Shell, Alcoa and all the others. And we have immense concern regarding the high level of carbon dioxide as well as other pollutants in the Geelong area that impacts on health as well as global warming. So my question to you, to take back to the government, is how do you reconcile the dichotomy between the argument that companies, the big polluters, are going to be given permits to allow them to go through a process of change, with the argument that those in Geelong are copying the effects of that pollution continuously. And I want you to specifically take the question back of, do not believe industry's consistent argument that it continuously costs jobs if a carbon price is brought in, because we ask you to challenge that, because our position for the last 10 years is it is not always true.
I think we might have an opportunity to hear from each of the commissioners on that question, Tim, certainly Jerry and Roger. We begin with perhaps Roger. Do you have an initial response?
First of all, a price drives and supports the sorts of things that you want to do. As far as the major industries are concerned, with pollution that is non-carbon pollution, we have mechanisms to deal with that. So far as carbon pollution is concerned, we need to give signals that enable them to have the investment that cleans and clarifies their production, it gives them confidence for the future, but which also sensibly protects us from acting in a way that leads to carbon leakage to other parts of the world. So it's a balancing act through this transition period. All the schemes that have been suggested so far have involved some form of protection for the emissions-intensive, trade-exposed sector as the world moves to price carbon more consistently among our trading partners.
I have, but I'd ask you to be wary of those like the EPA's EREP, which deals with that and has very, very little effect, we would argue.
Yeah, so you're separating the sort of local pollution issues that you might anticipate that the watchdog EPA might control, as opposed to the broader issues around a carbon price as well.
Yes, because those time-consuming changes are at this stage being monitored by the EPA.
The first part might be something you might need to take up with a new Premier.
Probably.
Let's have another question, if we may. Can we go right down the back? There's a lady sitting on the aisle in the mauve, I think, top.
My name's Renata Nelson and I'm just a citizen.
Speak up if you would.
My name's Renata Nelson and I'm just a citizen, and I'd like to ask Tim Flannery. Tim, could you please tell us that were a carbon tax or an emission trading scheme adopted globally today, by how much and by when would the Earth's temperature be reduced?
Good question.
Thank you, Renata. Look, I'll begin to answer that question and then hand over to Will Stephan, if I could, who's our real expert in this area. My understanding of the science is that if all carbon emissions were stopped tomorrow, it would take several centuries, or up to 1,000 years, for the temperature, the carbon dioxide levels and the temperatures to start falling appreciably. So we're committed to a certain amount of warming already by the gases that are in the air. And they don't come out very quickly. It takes a long time for those excess gases to be absorbed by the Earth's system. So the answer to the question is, even if everyone stopped, we're not going to get a reduction in temperature or emissions for some time after we do that. The other side of the coin, though, is what happens if we don't stop? And if we don't stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the warming trend will continue, and we then are threatened with the possibility of triggering a change that we can't control, even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases, because there's a number of positive feedback loops, as they're called in the Earth system, that may take over. But Will may be in a better position to discuss that than myself.
Yeah, just a couple of comments and put some numbers behind that. The challenge we face is to keep our budgeted emissions toward the middle of this century down to something on order of 700 billion tons of CO2. It sounds like a lot, but just to give you an idea, over the last decade, the world has emitted 300 billion tons. So if we could emit about 2.5 times that, and then limit it to that, we would keep the temperature to about 2 degrees above pre-industrial. This would peak out in the second half of the century and stabilize around 2100 and then slowly relax. Some of the longer-term phenomena that Tim referred to are things like the big ice sheets, which behave on much longer time frames. That would take longer for them to stabilize. But the point is, our target is to stabilize the climate at no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, and the associated changes that go along with that. that have various timescales. But we could stabilize temperature in the second half of this century if we really cut emissions down by mid-century.
Will, just before you go on, could you just give us just a very quick explanation of what causes climate change in the long term and in the shorter term, just so we've got a bit of an introduction to the science.
Okay, well, we start with the long term and look at the cycles of ice ages and warm periods. And we've been about 12,000 years in a warm period. That's a period in which agriculture was first developed, cities, towns, civilizations, and so on. That cycling between ice ages and warm periods is paced by the Earth's orbit around the sun. But the actual change in sunlight that comes in is very small compared to the big swings between ice ages and warm periods. Two things drive those swings. One are greenhouse gases, of which carbon dioxide is the most important, and the second is the ice ages waxing and waning. We are in a long, warm period of very stable climate, so we would not expect to see any appreciable change in climate over the next 10,000 years in the future. What we're seeing now is, just as sometimes nature puts more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the Earth warms. If humans do the same thing, it's a no-brainer. The Earth will warm, and that's exactly what we see. So what we're now doing is moving above that very long, stable period of climate that we expect to last for about 20 or 30,000 years. And we know the cause very, very well. This cause that we see now is not natural variability. We know very well the various types of natural variability, and what we're seeing now is a response to the additional greenhouse gases that have come into the atmosphere after the Industrial Revolution.
Thanks, Will. Another question. Gentleman here on... There's a gentleman sitting down I'll take first, if I may. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Phil. I'm a member of the local sustainability group. I understand that about 40% of Victoria's carbon emissions come from the production of aluminium, mainly here in Geelong and at Portland. And I also understand that about half the production of aluminium is exported as ingots. The other half is rolled into thin sheet to make beverage containers for beer and soft drinks. My question is, how will the carbon tax influence a change from, say, the production of beer cans, which you could argue are not that useful to society, to thin film to produce solar panels and other sustainable products? And what's in the way for Alcoa to bring in a deposit scheme so that aluminium cans can be recycled? So that's my question.
A couple of questions there, Tim. I'm wondering whether you might let Jerry have a go at that.
Actually, Rob, can I just add one more thing to that? I have seen a study which suggests that Alcoa's aluminium plant here in Geelong, being one of the oldest in the world, is also one of the least efficient, dirtiest, most polluting aluminium plants in the world. And that actually, if there was leakage of that production overseas, that would actually be a good thing, because that would go possibly to a more efficient, cleaner, less polluting plant.
I think the commissioners have got the gist of the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of question that I think you should be, in terms of the detail, addressing to the Alcoas of this world, because I've seen summaries of work which have suggested that this plant, on a level playing field, is competitive in terms of its energy use with plants around the world, and that's what will define the future of the plant in the long term. But mention has been made also of the short-term impact and the transition period as to whether that plant should be disadvantaged versus potential competitors overseas that didn't have a carbon tax on them. And as Roger said, that's been recognised as a legitimate concern for trade-exposed industries. In terms of the output of the plant and the products that are produced, ultimately, that gets driven by probably the global price of aluminium products and their carbon content and the way that consumers respond to that. So ultimately it's going to be consumers that will determine the sorts of things that the manufacturing companies make. Consumers will dictate that, and they will make their judgments based on the usefulness of the products. Other competitors that come in and that they find more appealing, and part of the consideration in the future will be the amount of impost that there is because of high energy use in the manufacture of those products. But it's not something that unless you had a government edict that would change it overnight.
Thank you. I'll come to you. There's a lady in the front here I'd like to take. I'd like to hear a question. I want to hear a question that sort of talks about the impact of climate change on biodiversity, or the living bits and pieces. I want to direct to Leslie in a moment, if I may. So think one up.
This is a very practical question and very
Let us know who you are first, please.
Pardon?
Explain to the audience who you are, please.
I'm Val Nichols, and I used to live and work in Geelong. I have now moved to country Victoria. And in my part of country Victoria, in 1995, I installed solar power. And I can only use 10 volt from my solar power system, because otherwise I need to use a qualified electrician. When I wanted to increase from 10 volt to 240 volt, I rang the electricity company and they sent someone out who looked at my land. But nothing has happened since. Yeah. And I would like to ask the panel what the connection is with commercial organisations who currently provide electricity when you want to convert your solar system.
Okay. I don't know whether we've got any electricians here. There might be one in the audience. But who wants to have a go? Tim? I think it's you.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I can speak with a little bit of personal experience because I live in a house with standalone solar, so we don't have any mains connection, we only run on solar, and we had to upgrade from a 12 volt system to a 240 volt system. We had to buy an inverter to do that, and that costs, I think the costs were around about $1,000, and then that inverter would do that for you. So it's something within it's an investment you have to make effectively. And you may get a smaller and cheaper inverter if you've got a small system.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Thank you. My name's Chris Dawson. I've been a consultant in the environment, energy and water industries for about 20 years. I think one of the problems the public has is grappling with the science. The communication of the science is not clear. So my suggestion and my question really is if each of the commissioners here tonight could cite the particular reputably published peer-reviewed empirical science clearly demonstrating that human carbon dioxide emissions are the major cause of any dangerous global warming, it would give a lot of people some comfort. And by empirical science, I don't mean models, unfortunately.
I'm going to let Leslie have a go at this because there's some stuff in her field.
Sure. It's really easy to understand why people are confused, and that's part of the reason we're doing this, because there's an awful lot of information out there, and it's really hard to tell unless you've got scientific background what's good and what isn't. There has been some recent publications put out there. One of the most recent, and I think one of the best, is from the Australian Academy of Sciences. And if anybody wants a really fairly easy to read, up-to-date, pithy document about climate change and its causes, simply Google Australian Academy of Sciences and it will get you there. And I can't think of really a better short document. Eventually, when our Commission website is up and running a bit better, we will be linking to that and all sorts of other credible sources of information.
Do those papers demonstrate the link between human carbon dioxide emissions and any global warming?
Do you want to talk about that?
The first thing you have to do is just say carbon dioxide and temperature change, whether the carbon dioxide comes from natural emissions or human. That's the real science. That's been known since about 1850. The first peer-reviewed published paper on that was done by John Tyndall well over 150 years ago, when he actually irradiated carbon dioxide with exactly the same wavelength of radiation of heat coming out from the Earth's surface. And lo and behold, it did absorb that radiation just as we thought. There have been hundreds of peer-reviewed papers since then which support that theory. Now, the evidence we have now, and this has nothing to do with models, are so-called fingerprints. The patterns of warming that you see differ whether it's solar radiation or whether it's carbon dioxide, because we know where carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. We know the properties because we measure them in the laboratory, peer-reviewed literature. We know the radiation coming out of the Earth's surface. Again, we measure that very carefully. And patterns such as nighttime low temperatures are rising more than daytime high temperatures. That's typical of greenhouse gas forcing the climate rather than sun. The fact that the upper atmosphere above the greenhouse gases is cooling and the atmosphere below is warming, again, is a fingerprint. So there are a number of these fingerprints, again observed, put in the peer-reviewed literature, fits with the physics and so on. I could go on, but I would urge you to look at Working Group 1 of the IPCC report and go through the reference list. Go through the reference list on all the peer-reviewed papers.
And Tim, you'd like to make a comment too?
I would just briefly, in terms of the greenhouse gases and their impact on warming the planet, one of the best demonstrations you can have is just considering the moon. The moon is about the same distance from the sun as the Earth is, yet its surface temperature is minus 15 degrees, which is just what the Earth would be if there were no greenhouse gases. So there you've got a really good example of how greenhouse gases bring our temperature up 30 degrees Celsius up to plus 15. And knowing that as greenhouse gases concentrations increase, and we can measure the increasing temperature of the planet, it's all very consistent. Could I say about models as well, while we're on them? Put three pieces of data together and you've got a model. We use models all the time for all sorts of things. We don't ever expect that they'll tell us the truth or predict the future, but they are a very, very good guide in a probabilistic sense to how large complex systems work. And we couldn't live without them in innumerable aspects of our lives. Why people are fixated on the climate models as particularly somehow untrustworthy is just...
Give us an example, Tim. Where else do we use models?
Oh, we use modelling in, well, petroleum exploration would be a great example. There's medical imaging and all this sort of stuff. I mean, my fellow scientists could probably pick some other examples that are in more everyday use.
Aircraft design. Every time you fly on an airplane, modern airplane, they've been designed by models of how the atmosphere works and how objects fly through it. And yet we trust the engineers, we trust the scientists who design those. And they're far safer than driving your motor car, for example.
Presumably we have models of nuclear reactors too.
That's right. We have models of weather systems. The weather predictions are the same sort of models, you know, in a small sense that are used for climate prediction and so forth. So it's not like models are something which are unique to the climate system or unfamiliar in terms of many human enterprises. It's the way you use them, it's important.
There's one on the far side there.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Rob. Who you are.
My name's Tom O'Connor from the Committee for Bellarine. Food, energy and water security. How do we build that into the equation? You know, we can talk about the science, and I must admit it goes over the head. How do we build that into the equation? You know, that really is, I guess, the outcome of it all. Yeah, how does it affect? And Rob, this is probably a question addressed to your good self. How are they built in? Food security, water security, and energy security. Whether we've got an abundance or a shortage, it doesn't really matter. But that predicates the survival of humanity.
You won't mind if I direct it to the Commission, will you?
Yes.
I think, do you want to take up, Tim?
Yeah.
Could I just briefly, I mean, we're getting a little bit outside the remit of the Commission now with these areas, but I just want to briefly comment that today we went and had a look at the Shell plant, the Shell petroleum plant. And that was very interesting because the engineers that run that said that, you know, a decade or two ago, if one part of the plant had broken down, they would have been able to continue on using the other plants and so produce their product. But today, it's also tightly integrated, that the breakdown in one part of the plant affects the whole thing. And I thought, that's really an analogy almost for the human species as we're evolving now. We're becoming so tightly interwoven and so tightly interdependent that a breakdown anywhere in the system has repercussions through the whole system. So when we consider food and water security and energy security now, these are big global issues that need to be dealt with. I don't think anyone's got any clear answers yet as to how we can manage the fragility of the system that we're building.
Leslie?
Could I just add a little bit to that about my particular area that I've done some research on? And that is one of the things that a lot of times people ask us questions and they say, but surely CO2, for example, is good for plants and therefore good for food. And that's actually true. CO2 is a fundamental thing that plants use to photosynthesize and produce our food, and it's the basis of our food chain. What most people don't realise though is when you grow a plant at higher CO2, and CO2 is appreciably being measured at higher and higher levels, they do grow faster, they grow bigger. They actually though become less nutritious because as they get bigger and grow faster, they take up less nitrogen proportionately to the amount of carbon in the tissues. And nitrogen is what plants use to build protein. So as plants grow at higher and higher CO2, they actually become less nutritious in terms of protein. So apart from, CO2 will have an impact on our food security via its impacts on climate. CO2 will also have a direct impact on the quality of the food we eat.
And whilst you're there, Leslie, what about other ecosystems?
Yeah, I've been researching the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and species for about the last 20 years. And one of the things that we're most concerned about is the impact of climate change on natural systems because they've got probably the least ability to adapt quickly enough. Species do evolve, but they evolve very slowly. It takes about 1 million years to make a new species, and we don't have that long for most species to adjust. So the IPCC estimated that with about 2 to 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels of warming, we may be committing between about 30 and 50% of global biodiversity to increased risk of extinction. Now, we're already at nearly 1 degree towards that goal, if you'd like to call it a goal. So we're very concerned. And places like the Great Barrier Reef, places like our alpine region, Kakadu National Park, they will be the first to suffer really major changes, and we're already seeing species responding very, very sensitively to climate change.
Examples?
Well, for example, what we would expect is as the climate zones shift, we expect species that can move, they can swim or fly, to move with the climate zones, to stay in their preferred climate zone that they're in now. And what we're actually seeing is a lot of species doing that. So in Australia, we're seeing species like birds move further and further south. We're seeing lots of marine species move south. We're seeing species move up mountains. We're seeing lots of differences in the timing of life cycles compared to, spring is being sprung much earlier than it used to be. So we know that even with fractions of degree of warming per decade, the natural ecosystems are responding very, very sensitively.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Sorry, Rob.
Sorry, Jerry.
Just to pick up a little bit on the energy security question, which I think is very important. As we move, from a high carbon environment to a low carbon environment, over a relatively short period of time, it's going to be a massive reinvestment in the infrastructure that we require to provide us with energy, and for that to happen, for that investment to happen, businesses will need a reasonably high degree of policy certainty going forward. People aren't going to invest in an uncertain environment without some sort of certainty that they've got a chance of getting their money back. Businesses take risks, but the risk out there that many would see at the moment is a high degree of uncertainty as to what's going to happen in terms of regulation. And the other thing, of course, that's necessary to drive us towards a lower carbon economy is to put a price on carbon so that the investments in the lower carbon environment become easier to justify. And that's very important for energy security going forward. Otherwise, we could end up with some serious discontinuities.
So your point is, if a price on carbon for an industry will deliver what? well, just tease out the business of uncertainty for business. So in other words, if I run a big business, I need a price on carbon because I need to know what the price of my pollution will be, so I know what level of investment I put into either a new brown coal power station or a solar thermal power station. Is that the case?
So that you know with a reasonable degree of certainty, what you're investing into. So for without a price on carbon, it's unlikely that you're going to get someone wanting to compete against a brown coal investment, unless there's other ways of incentivising it. History has taught us, I think, that market-based mechanisms which allow industry to innovate and make investment decisions is the right way to actually get the lowest cost outcome as we do inevitably move to a low cost, a low carbon environment.
I'm sure Roger will come into that later, but there's a gentleman there who's been waiting for a while. Thank you.
My name's Gavin Brown. I'm from the Geelong Greens and from Transition East Geelong. I understand the need for compensation for trade-exposed industries, although I do feel that it's not well explained and many people may not understand, and I think it would be, it's not my question, I think it would be helpful for an explanation of that tonight. But my question is really about coal-fired power stations. Under the emissions trading scheme that Labor put through, or tried to put through before the last election, coal-fired power stations were given free permit, so they were compensated. But yet they're not trade exposed. No one's going to imagine that coal-fired power stations are going to send their business overseas and we're going to get electricity from overseas. So I have two questions. Why was that the case? And what's the chances of stopping that from happening under a carbon tax?
Roger?
Okay. Why did that happen? Essentially, there are two reasons for it. One, there was a belief or a view that shareholders needed to be compensated to recognise for the fact that they hadn't anticipated a carbon price. Now, I'm not going to make any judgments about that. It was a shift in policy. We often compensate shifts in policy. But secondly, there was a concern to ensure that this didn't disrupt the stability of the electricity market, that those businesses were able to stay whole over the medium term in a way that enabled them to continue to provide some proportion of the bedrock power, the baseload power. Having said that, we know prices work. Ask any supermarket, ask any service station, ask any businessman who's considering an investment. So we know that in spite of that compensation, you would see a drive in new investments to go to much more carbon friendly modes of production of power, and you'd also see an incentive to clean up those power stations as far as you could, and that eventually they would be retired, perhaps much more early than they would otherwise have been done. So that's why there is some compensation for energy-intensive, non-trade exposed sectors. That's a matter of judgment about how much that should be, how much is based on equity for shareholders, and how much is based on stability of electrical systems.
Gentlemen, sorry, Tim?
Sorry, I might just add a brief. There was a question also to explain about trade exposed sector, and we saw a great example of that today at the Shell refinery, where they're competing directly with petroleum imports from Singapore or from India, wherever. And so if there is a price imposed on them that makes them uncompetitive, then they simply lose the competition, and we'll end up importing fuel, and those, the refinery will shut down. So there is a case in trading, so it's a very clear one, I think, for some sort of compensation.
Right at the back, gentleman with his hand up. Do you have a microphone yet?
I've got the mic here. My name's Ryan. I've just got a quick question for Tim. How much do you profit from all your scaremongering and alarmist false predictions? Thank you.
Okay. Well, could I just ask you, have you heard any Any sort of alarmist comments or false predictions this evening, or scaremongering this evening? I'm just asking you if you'd heard any this evening, and I don't think so. And what I can say is that we don't need a debate that's driven by scaremongering or rumours or anything else. What we need at the moment in this country is a very clear, level-headed debate that doesn't use inflammatory language and accuse people of things, but that seeks to get a better level of understanding among all Australians, really, on these core issues, because they will affect us one way or the other as we go on.
Professor Flannery, Richard Bolus from Carbon Training International. How do you rate the importance of investment in education and training to help reduce carbon emissions moving into the future? Do you foresee a stage where every organisation will have a carbon manager, just like today we have OH&S managers?
Look, well, I'd like to pass that question on to others, particularly Jerry, to comment on. But could I just say that, you know, when carbon has a cost, there's going to be someone on the board of every company, I presume, who's going to be responsible for that, and there'll be someone in the accounts section who will be accounting for it, so it will become embedded. But Jerry would know more than me.
There's certainly trends, Jerry. You might actually go back and look at a bit of the history of development even in your industry in that change.
Yeah, and you know, just looking at where companies are today, I think it's fair to say that the big multinational companies that have operations in Europe and the US and Australia, for example, they were probably in front of the curve, a lot of them, just because of their exposure to what was happening in Europe, to thinking about the move to a lower carbon economy. BP, for example, has been actively involved in the debate since about 1996, and the Shells of this world in exactly the same way. In fact, at the Shell refinery today, we met one of their executives who was responsible for carbon within Shell Australia. So those people do exist in the big companies. They exist in the big Australian companies. They may not be titled like that, but it's certainly, from my experience, a big component of some people's jobs, and in fact, in some companies, many people's jobs. So that's the big company. I think where there is a potential gap is as we move to the small and medium-sized businesses, what is the level of understanding of what the future holds in terms of the move to a lower carbon economy. So I think that's something that we can probably help with through our process.
Can I just get you to follow up? How has Europe responded? I mean, it's presented that Australia is at the cutting edge of all of this. Do you want to perhaps put that into a context for us?
Well, I think the way that Europe has responded is that they've been prepared to experiment. So post-Kyoto, they had a trading scheme, very experimental. They learnt a lot from it, and so for the next phase of the development of the carbon market in Europe, they'll know a lot more about how to do it. There's been a tremendous amount of work done in Europe. Some of it you could argue is being very expensive, but they were probably the foremost part of the world that's driving a carbon market through a cap and trade system. So there's a lot for us to actually learn from Europe, and we would be able to provide information over time as to how the rest of the world is actually responding to it. And it's I think many in this room would be very surprised about how much activity there is going on in the world, despite not having the overarching global agreement.
I'd just point out there too, just to say that the European emissions trading scheme is actually working, because there's a lot of misapprehension about that. There was an analysis done last year by the US-German Marshall Fund that showed that it was actually driving emissions down towards the target. So, and they look likely to achieve it. So.
Gentleman here in the front.
I'm Jan van Delfsen, a citizen. Talking about the predictability of the cost of fuel in the future, and a fixed carbon tax on it or carbon price, When everything's going great and the economy's booming, the price of oil will go up and any alternative will be competitive, particularly if there's a price on carbon. That will make it even more so. But what we've had in the past is then the economy has some sort of collapse and then oil becomes cheaper and then various alternatives go down or bankrupt. Is there some suggestion that those sorts of alternatives should be protected from such downturns in the oil market, for instance?
Where would you like to direct that, Tim? Perhaps Roger?
Well, let's get this in perspective. Garneau's latest paper suggested that for a carbon price of between $20 and $30 a tonne, the impact on the average cost would be somewhere between 5 and 7 cents a litre of standard fuel. That immediately of itself, with two things you could note. First of all, it does provide incentives for alternative, less carbon intensive fuel suppliers. But secondly, in the short term at least, it's the equivalent of perhaps $2.50 to $3.50 on a tank of fuel, depending on how big your car is. At least at my service station, it goes up and down by much more than that in the short run. But in the longer run, it's not just price in the automotive sector that matters. It's also design standards. And fuel efficiency design standards and public transport alternatives and progressively urban design are quite critical. Fuels markets, and Jerry is an expert in this, have always been somewhat volatile. We've been through a long period where the real price of fuel has declined. It is likely that as we have to go to more and more unconventional sources for traditional fossil fuels, very deep wells, difficult to extract oil shales, that their prices will increase. But alternative fuels have to be able to manage the normal commercial risks above and beyond those, above and beyond the price floor, the relative price floor that a carbon price will assist them with, and that's always been so, and I guess always will be so. Jerry, am I being overly academic there?
No, I think you are spot on. The only other comment I would make is that the strength of in supply and demand terms, the strength of the Australian economy is irrelevant to what the price of fuel is. It's a global resource which is determined by supply and demand globally. So long term, that's what will affect the price of oil. And as Roger said, the world is going to increasingly difficult places and difficult technologies to extract oil. And over 50% of the reserves in the oil sit in the Middle East, Russia, and West Africa. So there is a real case, I think, that says that security of supply is going to be more problematic in the future unless we actually diversify and start moving to a lower carbon environment as well.
The lady here in the red, thank you.
My name's Lynn, I come from Werribee. I'm just wondering...
Just put the microphone close to your mouth, if you would.
Isn't it true that the world is suffering a lot from deforestation, and hasn't that contributed a lot to the greenhouse gases in the world? And what is Australia doing to help counteract that?
Leslie?
The figures that I'm aware of indicate that, I don't know about the global figure, but in Australia, deforestation accounts for about 18% of our emissions every year. So yes, deforestation is an enormous contributor to emissions as well as generally to biodiversity loss. Roger or some of the others might have more details about this, but one of the ways in which a carbon price might be a win-win situation for conservation is that if it encourages tree planting and encourages restoration of native vegetation, that will sequester carbon as well as provide habitat. So I think it's a really good example of a potential win-win and opportunity for environmental conservation using carbon pricing as a mechanism.
So can I add to what Leslie has said? That is this. Australia is important, and more particularly land clearing has been important to Australia as a source of emissions. We have done quite a lot over the last 20 years to reduce that. But where we have to act globally is to reduce deforestation in the great tropical rainforests. And at the moment, that is one area where at the global level we can see progress, slow and stuttering, but definitely happening in the international negotiations. Because if we can turn round and slow the extent of clearance of forests in the Amazon, in Indonesia, in the Congo, we can indeed, at a very low overall cost and at a high biodiversity gain, reduce a significant proportion of global greenhouse gases. We have to do it reliably though. We have to make sure that it's real, and we have to make sure that the people who live in and who have been trying to extract resources from those forests get proper compensation for it through the international community. And I'm positive that this has begun to move forward in quite a real way in the world, and remote satellite imaging and carbon accounting is really providing a tool that will enable us to say, this is real, this can be paid for, and then the tricky question is, how do we make sure that the villagers, the people who otherwise have this incentive to clear, get some benefit from that themselves, so that the rest of the world's not just imposing it on them. But I'm quite positive about that and having multiple payoffs.
We might have given that Australia's emissions reduction target is 5% guaranteed by 2020, I might just, from the commissioners, think how might we most quickly achieve that? You might bear that in mind. There's a gentleman there with a blue shirt on who's been waiting for a while.
Yes, John Lambert. I've been involved in energy conservation and renewables for 35 years, and what I'm about to say is that I shouldn't be wasting my time in that field. It seems to me in Australia our problem is we've adopted the American approach to urban infrastructure with very low population densities of about 1,200 people per square kilometre. The Europeans have high density infrastructure with 4,500 people per square kilometres or more. It was fine for us to each have our individual house with an individual family and an individual block of land in an empty country, but the price we're paying is in energy consumption, and it also creates the problem that public transport will never work because it's not dense enough. There's nothing I've heard that is tending to make governments in any area change that mode of infrastructure building. We've got Armstrong Creek here, that's being built entirely along the same lines, very energy wasteful in its infrastructure. We've got the proposals in Melbourne for 70,000 people, exactly the same. I don't see that a carbon tax will impact on all. What I ask the Commission is, have they got any ideas about how we could stop building the infrastructure we've had for decades and turn it around and go for more energy efficient infrastructure?
If I can respond to that again. I think you're right. It's not a moral problem that we were like that. It's about a question of timing and growth. All of the nations that have grown rapidly since the car was invented have tended to go to a more decentralised pattern. However, what you can see happening is that densification is occurring even within Australia. We have to provide incentives and constraints and assistance to develop denser corridors and nodes around that enable public transport and that provide that choice. This is what I meant earlier when I said it's never going to be just a carbon price. In the long run, it's about many complementary measures, including planning measures associated with the urban shape. Now, having said that, we have got what we have got. You know, the fact is that we do have large decentralised cities, so it's a question of building back from that, and it will happen relatively slowly because we only add an increment of about 3% per annum to the housing stock.
Rob, sorry,
yes,
could I just ask that we might turn to some of the questions that people were kind enough to send earlier on? Because
absolutely.
I'm sure there's people waiting for their question to be read out.
Okay.
So.
There's one that said, I think this is in your space, Tim. If the current climate change event turns out to be a natural event that is not caused by human-induced carbon cycle changes, then what's the view of the Climate Commission on A, attempting to modify or control the climate change event? A bit of climatic engineering, is that a possibility?
Well, I think what that question is saying is that if this is a natural event, so if it's not caused by humans, and that's one thing that the climate scientists are very, very clear on and very certain on, and Will can perhaps talk to that. What is the possibility of trying to control it? Is that was the point of the question?
Can we manage? I mean, if we accept the climate science, we would in a sense manage the climate. If it turns out to be a natural event, can we manage it another way?
Well, look, let's park the natural event off to the side, and Will can talk to whether it's a natural event or not. But could I just say, I think what the question's getting at there is sort of geoengineering, really, whether we could use other technologies. And this is very much a live debate in some areas. I sit on the board of a group at Oxford University that is trying to get a clearer understanding around what the geoengineering options are and how what sort of constraints are required, really, before we move to consider those options. Because, you know, at that point, we're dealing with fairly drastic interventions with the planetary system, and we're in a position at the moment where we've got a very immature political and even public dialogue around those issues. But so difficult, complex stuff way out there, and I don't think we're not going to be worrying about it this year or next year, but 20, 30 years from now, this might be a much more live debate. But Will,
Tim?
perhaps...
I will.
Just add very, very quickly, the scientific community is more than 90% sure that what we're seeing is not a natural swing in climate. As I mentioned earlier, it is due to the additional greenhouse gases that industrial activities primarily and some deforestation is put up into the atmosphere. That's about as close to a consensus that you'll ever get in the scientific community. There's basically no doubt in the scientific community about it. Second point, just to complement what Tim said, is the whole aim of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by whatever economic instruments and other regulatory measures you take, whatever you decide is the best, is to actually take that pressure back off the natural climate system that we're putting on through the additional greenhouse gases, so that we in fact don't have to manage the climate. We let nature manage the climate as it always has. So there's a big philosophical and ethical difference and scientific difference between letting emissions go and then trying to manage the climate somehow, as Tim said, or taking the pressure back off the climate, which is what the current debate is about in terms of emission abatement.
Will, where are we heading right now? Leslie said we're getting close to 1. What are the...
Yeah, okay. We're sitting at about 0.8 of a degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level now. That's a global average. There is a lot of momentum in the system, mainly stored in the ocean. If we could cut emissions to 0 tomorrow, which we can't, and let the climate slowly come to equilibrium, we'll get about another 0.4 of a degree. So we're sitting at about 1.2 guaranteed. We think, as we said earlier, that anything above 2 degrees will put us in some reasonably dangerous territory, and some scientists argue that 1.5 is a better number. This puts a real sense of urgency on getting these emissions down. If we don't, if we can continue on the trajectory we're on now, a good bet is somewhere around 4 degrees late this century, with a range of a best case of maybe 2.5 and a worst case of around 6 above pre-industrial. 4 degrees is pretty frightening from those of us who understand what the impacts of...
Well, what happens at +4? What does the science tell us is happening at +4?
Well, you're going to get massive heat waves. Let's just give you an example. The heat wave that we had in Melbourne in February 2009, which was, this was a mega event. It was over 3 degrees above the previous high temperature. That's unheard of when you look at climate records. Heat wave in Russia, heat wave in Europe in 2003. If we keep going toward a 4-degree world, by the middle of the century, that will be an everyday summer event. At 4 degrees average temperature rise, say by 2080, that event in Melbourne will be a cool summer day. All right? This is what it means in terms of how extremes change. They change far more than averages. And that, to give you another indicator, when we swing from an ice age to a warm period, these big swings where in an ice age, most of the northern hemisphere and much of it is under ice, that temperature swing is about 5 degrees in average temperature. So we're headed for very close to the same magnitude of temperature change as between an ice age and a warm period. Don't be fooled by what we think, well, going from 24 to 28, that's not a big change. It's a huge change in terms of how the climate system operates. Those are some of the indicators we can look at.
Yeah, I was going to say, how are ecosystems responding at +4, Leslie?
At +4, I don't even like to think about +4. It's too scary. Let me just give you the example of the Great Barrier Reef, and most of you will have heard of the problem that the reef has in a hot summer, it bleaches. Since 1979, the reef's had between about 7 and 10 bleaching events, depending on how you define a bleaching event, and we don't know of any bleaching events before 1979. Now, a bleaching event occurs when the sea surface temperature gets about 1 degree above the long-term maximum summer temperature. So you only need 1 degree for part of the reef to bleach and die. As I said, we've had between 7 and 10 major bleaching events. The worst were in 1998 and 2002, which were particularly hot years. If we keep on the trajectory that we're going on now, even before we get, way before we get to 4 degrees, the reef will bleach every single year by about 2030. So that means there's no time in between events for the reef to recover, and the coral reef will turn into an algal bed, which is, it'll have a bit of biodiversity there, but you probably wouldn't want to go and snorkel in it. So 4 degrees from a biological point of view, frankly, it's too scary to even think about.
Here's a very local one. We've talked around this a bit. This is a very specific one. Where are Alcoa workers going to get jobs when the Point Henry smelter is shut down because it cannot compete with exports from China and elsewhere where no carbon tax applies? I think Roger?
Okay. Going back to what I said at the beginning of this process, the Grattan Institute...
Whoa.
Tell me when you
Everything
want.
okay? Can we continue? Can someone let me know that it's okay for us to proceed? Not sure. Okay, thank you. Continue, Roger.
I'm sorry, I've lost...
it was about jobs at Alcoa.
The Alcoa smelter.
And competition from China without an ETS.
Look, among my sins, I'm a member of the policy committee of the Grattan Institute in the University of Melbourne. Very independent institute, as I said earlier. They've done a major review of the impact of a carbon price on a number of highly energy intensive sectors. One of those plants that they looked at was Point Henry. Point Henry is in fact a very economically efficient producer on a global scale, and providing it gets some some assistance from government, by the way of free permits or rebates, its future looks quite robust. So I think there's a really big, and every scheme that I've ever seen has had that built into it, including many of the international schemes. So I'm not sure that the premise of the scheme, that workers at Alcoa will lose their jobs because of climate change, is right. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's extremely unlikely on any politically plausible scheme or economically plausible scheme that I could see being introduced. Now, those are just observations. We don't make policy advice or recommendations to government.
And on the point of China without a carbon tax?
Well, China, first of all, this is terrible name dropping, but I'm also on Wen Jiabao's advisory committee on environment and development, and we meet with him once a year. China is actually moving quite hard to reduce emissions and the emissions intensity of its population. Yes, absolute emissions in China will grow as the income of its people will increase, but they're still fractionally, on a per capita basis, what our emissions are. The Chinese aluminium industry effectively balances its imports. China is not a huge net exporter, and they are progressively moving away from highly energy intensive export focused sectors, because they realise how much that exposes them and their economy, not just to greenhouse and domestic pollution, but also to global economic turmoil, and it's been really reinforced by the GFC.
Here's a question from Vera Lubchenko, and she asks, apart from introducing a carbon tax, how will the government get the required behaviour change to get people consuming less and living more sustainably?
Look, I really think that is only going to come with increased public awareness of what's at stake. And as we've heard from Will and Leslie, some of the things are at stake if we don't act on these issues. And also a bit more of a sense of responsibility for the future. We can often be really short-term, but I mean, I don't want to be trite about it, but it is events like this that start to bed down the sort of change that we need. And they're not going to happen quickly. It's going to take us quite a while, I think, to change some of the things we do that are unsustainable. But it's down to individuals. It really is. It's funny, one of my great scientific heroes, a man called Bill Hamilton, who was interested in what evolution had produced, said just before he died, he was investigating a project which was about the stability of ecosystems, and he said something like, I'm really interested in when the next Genghis Khan species is going to arise and destroy the planet. And there's a sort of a theoretical interest you can have through mathematical modelling and so forth, and through looking at ecosystems and the way they work. But as I read that paper, I started thinking, we don't need to look very far to find out about the next Genghis Khan species. We need to just ask ourselves what we're doing, perhaps. And it's the great question.
There's a question here, I'm just going to paraphrase it a little, but it's quite appropriate to ask it now, and it's a bit about, where have you scientists been recently? The question is, how's the ordinary person to know which information to believe? I think we might have answered that, but why does there appear to be no public debate between the IPCC experts and the alternative sceptic view? I think this falls to Leslie and Will.
Yeah, I'll have a first go at that. The reason there isn't is because there actually isn't a debate in the scientific community. But the questioner can certainly be excused for believing there is a debate, because what you see in the public over the past year or so has diverged radically from what goes on in the scientific community. The scientific community debates things through peer-reviewed literature, evidence-based, how well can you observe things, explain the observations, how well does it agree with theory, and we debate this quite vigorously. And there's some aspects of climate change which we are still debating. Tropical cyclones, for example, how rainfall patterns will change. There's a lot of uncertainties around that. But the key point is the climate shifting? Is it getting warmer? Unequivocal is the word that we use. What's the cause for that? The emission of greenhouse gases from human activities. In the scientific literature, there is no debate about those topics. What you see out in the media and in the press is what a lot of my colleagues call a phony or false debate. And the reason you're not seeing many of them out there is, quite honestly, they are frustrated and really annoyed by the way the media has treated them. And so they're going back to the bench, going back to their ships, going back out to the field sites to do their research, which is what they're paid for. They're not paid for standing up in front of the media against someone who is not an expert and having to go through that sort of experience. So basically, on the fundamental science of climate change, there is no debate. There hasn't been for a couple of decades. And if you really want to test my statement about that, then you go into the peer-reviewed literature and see if you can find a debate, and you can't.
Thank you,
Rob,
Rob.
can I say something? I just wanted to add to that. I mean, yes, it's true, as Will says, there's lots of climate scientists that are getting pretty sick of it and have retreated back into their burrows to look at their test tubes, and a few foolish ones like Will and I, you know, we're here. Climate scientists are a really funny bunch. They're the only scientists that wake up every morning and hope that they're wrong. Because if they're wrong, we'll all be okay. It's just that if we're right, we potentially won't be okay. There are quite a lot of surveys all the time, not just about what the public thinks about climate change, but about what scientists think. The last one that I read that involved a lot of scientists was a study done a couple of years ago by the Pew Institute in the US. And they surveyed publishing scientists, so people who are actively doing research, and they got consensus of 98% of those scientists in terms of the climate changing and what is the probable cause. And so I would ask those of you that are out there that are still a bit in the sceptical camp about this, if you turned up at the airport and you're about to get on a plane and 98 out of 100 Qantas engineers said, well, I think there's a 90% chance that this plane will crash, you know, would you get on it? And then even if you were going to get on it and take the risk, because the two that, you know, looked pretty confident that it wasn't going to crash, would you take your family with you? And that's really what we're talking about.
Can I ask, let me just get through some questions. This question is the corollary of the one we asked about Alcoa and loss of jobs. And this might go to you, Jerry, and it's really on the opportunistic side. It says, how will a carbon tax and ETS assist Geelong transition to a low-carbon economy, and what influence will this have on new industries and employment opportunities in Geelong? So where's the future?
Well, a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme, a price on carbon, whatever we call it, will have two impacts. Number one, it will will provide an additional incentive for people to become less energy intensive in terms of the amount of energy they use. And then the other part of it, of course, it will provide an incentive for investments. We've already talked through the trade exposed industries here. Prima facie, providing they get through the transition period, then they're competing on the international stage and they stand on their own 2 feet, as they do today. Other energy opportunities, I think that's really for the grassroots and the entrepreneurs and the businesses that are involved in Geelong to get involved.
BP became beyond petroleum, got into solar. Was that a successful venture?
In many ways, it was a tremendous learning experience. We never made a lot of money out of solar. But we did learn a lot about the development of technology in the renewables space. We're also, and I say we with BP, I still got the habit, I'm afraid. BP is one of the biggest solar power providers in the US, and is hugely into biofuels in Brazil, where we believe that there are sustainable ways in which you can actually grow sugarcane and process it, not only through first generation, which is the way that we do it today, producing ethanol, but second generation, which is actually going to be even more environmentally sustainable and low energy. So, those are the sort of things that when people see opportunities, when you actually take a view as to what the carbon, what the cost of carbon is going to be in the future, and that's facilitated by, government regulation or moving into an ETS or a carbon tax or a carbon price. Once those things are in place, then that increases the confidence and will increase the investment. But at the moment, I have to say, whilst there's uncertainty as to what the policy settings are going to be, then it's difficult to see businesses investing with the same degree of confidence.
Tim?
Rob, could I just say we've onto the last few minutes, and I'd love to just have a couple more questions from the audience. If anyone's got a burning short one, put your hand up. We'll deal with it promptly, and I'll wrap up and get us finished by 7.
Gentleman way at the back there with his hand up high. And I'm just trying to pick people. This gentleman here on my left had his hand up for a while. Oh, this gentleman here already has the microphone too. So could you ask your question, please? Then the gentleman at the back, then this one here.
My name's Philip Eubergang. I'm a representative of a company called the Carbon Farm. The question's for Professor Flannery. From what I find, Geelong is part of a rural area, and the ETS is, and the carbon tax we know is, is a means of taxing the mining company. There's a huge opportunity with agriculture. In the last 27 years, that's what I've been dealing with, is carbon and measuring it, peer review program through the NATA accreditation system. And last year we had farmers that grew 10,000 hectares of wheat, produced 800,000 tonnes. And, no one at Climate Change wanted to talk about it. And if you want to talk about price, I mean, they'd take $2.50, $3.50 today if you had it.
Question?
Yeah, the question is, will you listen as a commission to the opportunities and relook at agriculture? Because as a climate sink, it's bigger than the oceans if you take in the 300-to-1 ratio with carbon dioxide emission equivalent.
I think I've got it. Who wants to have a go at that? So
it was
part of the national debate, so it's carbon in agriculture.
Look, just very, very briefly, we as a Commission haven't turned our mind particularly to that area yet. I think as time goes on, we will have a look, particularly at the carbon farming initiative and so forth. And I agree with you, the potential there for storing carbon in the soil through a number of different technologies and in trees is very substantial.
Gentleman here has a microphone, and if we could take that microphone to the gentleman at the back.
My name is Gordon Alderson, citizen of Geelong. My question perhaps is to Professor Stephan firstly. My understanding of the science is that we need to be very careful to differentiate between correlation and causation when it comes to carbon dioxide. Because, as I understand it, as the oceans heat up, they give off carbon dioxide. And so my summation of that is that it's the heating that causes the carbon dioxide, not the carbon dioxide that causes the heating. And further to that, just looking at the numbers, I understand that in about 86,000 molecules of air, about 32 of those are carbon dioxide molecules, and just one of those, 32, has been caused by human activity. So my question is, with one molecule in 86,000 molecules of air, how can that one molecule, A, be identified as one that's coming from human sources, and secondly, how can it be blamed for heating when it's the other way around?
Okay. No, look, The interaction between ocean temperature and CO2 is what we call a feedback. It's part of a system process. As oceans warm, they give out more CO2, but as there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, it warms the Earth's surface and the ocean zone warm more, and so on. This is the major feedback loop, one of the two major feedback loops that drives the Earth from an ice age to a warm period. So it isn't either or, it's a feedback loop. We know the physical properties of CO2 very well. They do warm the planet. We know the solubility of CO2 in ocean water. It's more soluble in cold water. So you're partly right. But the other part of the equation is CO2 does warm the surface of the planet. Second thing, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, first of all, just a slight correction there. The pre-industrial concentration was 280 parts per million. Now it's approaching 390, so it's far more than what you say. But nevertheless, compared to all the other gases, it's very small. So let me address that second part of the question. The important analogies here are, depending on the nature of a substance, very small quantities have a very big impact. Look at the nuclei, a radioactive nuclear material being emitted by the Japanese reactors. That's much, much lower in concentration than CO2, and yet,
if you could just
and yet it has a very large effect. So what I'm saying is that don't compare a percentage of CO2 compared to nitrogen gas, which is inert. The point is, how many billions of tons of CO2 are in the atmosphere? What are the properties of that CO2? How much radiation does it absorb? And how much radiation does it re-emit? Those are all quantitative numbers that we know very well. It's all basic physics. And we know that the amount of CO2, the additional CO2 that we've put in, should raise the Earth's temperature by about 1.2 or 1.3 degrees at equilibrium, and it's exactly where we're tracking. So all the physics adds up. And it doesn't matter what sort of percentages or molecule per molecule you say. We know how many billions of tons are there. We know its properties. We know what it does. And that's exactly what we're observing.
Now, I've already eaten up... I've already eaten up more than 50% of Tim's wrap-up time. I'm going to leave you about 2.5. I'm sorry, sir, you've had your go. Can your question be very quick? No, can it be very quick? Go.
Okay. We've had so much about energy. I'm happy with it. Thank you for the panel. Graham Lorimer, retired civil engineer. Very happy to have this debate. See the need for for carbon reduction. My problem is there seems to be a silence from government and from all the people that say we have nuclear or not nuclear. It seems to be the horns of a dilemma. We don't hear much about the geothermal energy. Now, Tim has, in his book in 2005 in South Australia, was very excited that the drilling down there was showing possibilities of a great breakthrough. In 2008, we were told in the Advertiser, great possibilities. A month later, one of the scientists of Melbourne said, sorry, it's going to be 5 or 10 years with the backing of government and so on. Why is government so silent on the possibility of probably the safest, cleanest, load-bearing power source in geothermal energy? The drilling is now done. We know we can drill 5 to 10 miles down, but we don't know the geology. The geology needs looking at. How can we encourage the government, Tim, to do more to promote exploratory work, research on underground geology and the water transmission under the earth in safe areas like Australia?
Thank you. Look, I did promise to get everyone home in time for the game and end up promptly at 7 o'clock. I'm going to do my very best to do that. Could I just say geothermal energy still has great promise. It's slow developing, and there's a number of reasons for that. You know, all new technologies take a certain amount of time to develop and come to scale. It does concern me, however, that, well, not just Australia, but many countries lack sort of medium-term energy strategies. You know, where we've got some very good programs in place, like the mandated renewable energy target and so forth, which have been very good for wind and photovoltaics, which are, you know, quite mature. But we haven't been quite so good at developing some of those other energy sources, which I think will be very important in future, like concentrated PV, for example, or geothermal. And it's proved more difficult to do that, but it is something I think we desperately need to do. could I just, in wrapping up, thank you all for being here. This has been a tremendous learning experience, I think, for me, for my fellow commissioners, and hopefully for you as well. It's been a really great engagement, and I do thank you for your fantastic questions, the breadth of questions, the honesty with which you've asked them. And I'd just like to wish you all the very best for the future and hope that this doesn't end your engagement with climate issues. There's a website which is under development for the Commission. We're hoping that we can stay in touch with the people we meet through our various meetings around the country. So if you're online, please check the website and look to us for updates, and we'll try to get messages out to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that. Can I remind you all to complete your feedback forms and hand them back to the registration desk? It's very important that you do. Your other questions will be answered on the website, so if you asked a question that hasn't been answered, look for an answer there, and if you still have a question to submit, put it on the website and it will be answered. Thank you all for your time. We hope it's been valuable for you. Thank you for your questions, and please thank our Commission once again for being here this evening. Good evening.